Good morning, this is Angela with Parker's Permaculture. I want to apologize in advance for the video quality here. It's dark in this room. This morning I got a whole head or half a head full of Botox because I have familial hemiplegic migraine disorder, and so that's the treatment that I get. It's really improved my quality of life substantially, but after I get that series of like 17 shots in my head, I have to rest in a quiet, dark place for a number of hours and not get my blood pressure up, not be in the bright sunshine, because doing so will result in a really bad rebound headache. So I'm sorry that it's dark in here right now. I wanted to make a quick response to the video that I put out yesterday, I think, where I talked about this myth that gets perpetuated, that if you grow zucchini next to a melon, or you grow a cucumber next to your winter squash, or you grow a watermelon next to your pumpkins, that you are going to get a weird, funky mix of the two of them. For the sake of brevity, I did not go down a rabbit hole about plant breeding and hybridization. Now, my training is in botany. I have a degree in biology. That is kind of my passion, and I have a big tendency to nerd out and get very long-winded. So I tried to keep it short and sweet so that we could get to the point of that video, which is refuting this myth, and that you are going to end up with some kind of weird hybrid if you grow a watermelon next to your winter squash, that the fruit will be weird and wonky and somehow a cross between the two of them. That's absolutely not true. And I was trying to help gardeners see that you don't have to worry about that. You can feel confident growing your different cucurbits next to each other, knowing that they're not going to cross, right? The claim was anything in the family Cucurbitaceae will cross with anything else in that family. And that's not true. First, cross-pollination does not work that way. It does not impact this year's fruit at all. And second, that's not how hybridization works. So I didn't mean to gloss over all of the, nerding out that could happen when we're talking about plant breeding. And I'm sorry if that was confusing. That was not my intent. So someone had raised the point like, oh, my professor says that, you can get hybrids, interspecific hybrids with cucurbits. And yes, you can. In fact, so interspecific hybrid is when you have two different species in the same genera and you cross them and they get an offspring. The vast majority of the time, that offspring is sterile and cannot produce seeds of its own. There is the potential for that to happen, but it's not the rule. It is the exception to the rule. So there has to be genetic compatibility, and there has to be the potential for them to cross-pollinate and produce viable offspring. But the bulk of the time, that is not what we're talking about. So I realize that it's important to talk about when there are exceptions to the rule, but we also don't want to get bogged down with those kind of outliers that can happen. Now, there is one really good success story that I mentioned on my blog and I did not talk about in the video that I wanted to talk about briefly here. Cucurbita moscata, which for most of us who are North American gardeners, is the species where we get the butternut squash. Everybody knows what a butternut is. It's ubiquitous. Most of the time when you're buying canned pumpkin in the grocery store, it's actually butternut. Cucurbita moscata is highly resistant to squash vine borers and to a number of fungal diseases that cucurbits can be prone to. And so for a long time, plant breeders have sought to make an interspecific cross between Cucurbita moscata and Cucurbita maxima or Cucurbita pepo, and really failed at it. It does not cross readily. The garden myth that you can grow a butternut in your garden and it will always come true from seed has a large kernel of truth to it, because Cucurbita moscata does not readily cross with other cucurbits. And so since butternut is one of 3 varieties that are grown of that species, and most American gardeners are going to be growing only the butternut, you really can save the seeds and it'll come true from seed year after year. That doesn't mean it's not possible to ever get an interspecific hybrid, particularly when plant breeders work at it for decades. In the last century, there was a successful and very, very tasty cross, and I mention it in my blog post, made of a Cucurbita maxima and a Cucurbita moscata, and that is the Tetsuka Budo squash. Now, this squash is sterile, and not only is it sterile, it can't even produce viable pollen. So if you grow a Tetsuka Budo, you can't simply grow 2 vines of that variety and get fruit. You have to grow either a Hubbard or a butternut next to it in order to get viable fruit produced. So not only does it not produce its own seed, it can't even produce its own pollen. It is a very tasty fruit, and the reason that it was created was, again, high resistance to squash vine borers, which are a big problem in southern states and in Central and South America. And so you have a much more disease-resistant plant that yields a very tasty fruit that does have to be cured for, I think like 4 to 6 weeks before it's edible, so you can't really eat it right off the vine. But those hybrids are rare. They're few and far between. Think about it. If we could easily get a cross between all of those, they would be, and think of the millions of gardeners who grow them. They would be very present. My kids are getting snacks out of the fridge. It would be something that occurs readily in our gardens, and it just doesn't. So those are two different species in the same genus, Interspecific Hybrid. Rarely in plants, you can also get intergeneric hybrids, which are between two different genera. That's even more rare and also likely to be seedless or have non-viable seeds. The tangelo is a great example of that. And there are also some crosses between like wheat and barley, and I think triticale is an intergeneric cross. That doesn't mean that those are viable, and it also doesn't mean that they just randomly happen all the time in your garden. It means there's something that plant breeders have carefully selected for, often taking decades of trying until they get those things. So the person who left this comment said, well, my botany professor says that you can get, two different cucumis to breed with each other. When we are looking at our domestic varieties of squash and our domestic varieties of cucumbers, some of those have experienced speciation from an ancestral form. So when you have the plant that you're talking about and its progenitor in the same area, you can get them breeding back with each other because they are so genetically similar. One was bred from the other. And so it's much more likely that you would get hybridization from that could occur. But again, I feel like we're nerding out and going down to these are all the outliers and exceptions to the rule. But since someone did question me about it, and I really wasn't clear enough in the initial video because I did not want to get long-winded, I thought, well, I'll go ahead and talk about it here. Because I can't resist one more little bit of nerding out here, I also wanted to add that when we're looking at interspecific hybrids, those are more likely to occur when you're looking at two separate species that have an overlap of their habitat. In those edges, in permaculture, we say use and value the marginal, use your edges. In those areas, hybridization is more likely to occur. This is good food for thought when folks are claiming that they have gotten a pumpkin watermelon hybrid, knowing that watermelon originate in Africa and our pumpkins originate in South America. Where is the overlap of habitat there? When we are growing our cucurbits in our garden, my point still stands. You can grow a watermelon next to a squash and you will not get a cross. You won't get a cross right now because that's not how cross-pollination works. The watermelon that you're growing, in fact, my daughter shared a TikTok with me where someone claimed they were getting a watermelon squash hybrid out of their garden. It was just an immature watermelon. It's just immature. They didn't let it ripen and develop the sugars. It's not a weird hybrid. That doesn't happen. You can confidently grow your different cucurbits, different species, different genera of cucurbits next to each other, and know that you are not going to get random crosses in your garden. Those times that we do get crosses, that is the exception to the rule. That is something that plant breeders are striving for and often have to work for long periods, many generations, many attempts. It's not something that is going to happen willy-nilly and frequently in your garden. So I hope that clarified that point a little bit. I don't want folks to think that I'm glossing over those details. I'm really trying to strike that balance between what is helpful information for gardeners based on my training, based on my degree, and what is let's sit around and nerd out together as a bunch of total plant geeks who could just talk about all the well, what if we did this? What if, oh, here's that rare instance where this was able to be, bred with this and you got a viable offspring, or this new hybrid was formed in I don't want to go down those rabbit holes and bore my subscribers. So if that's something that you're interested in, goodness knows I could sit and talk about that stuff forever. My poor friend Keith, who's a chemist, he has to endure those nerdy conversations with me. I think maybe he enjoys them, but finding those friends that you can nerd out with is really important. But for the sake of that video that I made, I didn't want to be that person that was doing all the, okay, except for this, here's this little exception here and this little outlier here. But I didn't want to misrepresent what's happening, but definitely in your garden, as I said in the last video, you can grow your cucumber next to your zucchini and they're not going to create a hybrid. You can grow your melon next to your squash and they're not going to create a hybrid. I hope that's helpful for you all. I hope that cleared that up a little bit more. thank you for those of you that weighed in on the conversation. I love to dialogue about that kind of stuff. And I do appreciate especially feedback of like, actually, if you could have fleshed that out a little bit more, if you could have just gone down that rabbit hole a little bit farther, if you could have taken those things that you were worried were going to be boring for other folks, or you were worried about getting too wordy, then I would love that kind of feedback. Like, Angela, I would love it if you would go more in depth on this. Or like, Angela, I was really bored. You talked way too much about all of the little rabbit holes and all of the little, tributaries off of this main topic. So I am going to go back to editing and doing quiet things. I hope you all are staying well and safe. Please check out my blog where I am trying to talk about the videos that I post here, but also like go more in depth or talk about things that I don't talk about on YouTube at all. So thanks again. I appreciate the feedback. I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate all of you. Thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for understanding that sometimes I may not explain as well as I should, or I may over explain, and I appreciate the grace when I do either one of those things. Thanks.